I'm honest. I'm honest. I face the facts. I missed all the things that make a woman.
For most people who grew up watching classic Hollywood films, Katharine Hepburn was the picture of strength and independence. She was bold, sharp, and completely in control of herself and her image. The public knew her as someone almost untouchable, a woman who lived by her own rules and answered to no one. Most people also knew about her long and deeply personal bond with Spencer Tracy, the actor she stayed close to for decades until his death. But beneath all of that, behind the carefully polished surface, there was another side of Hepburn's life that very few people ever got to see. According to those who studied her life closely, Hepburn allegedly kept a private list of 7 women she had secretly been involved with over the years. These were not casual friendships. They were real emotional connections, hidden from public view and managed with tremendous care. What made them even more striking was how they ended. Nearly every one of these relationships closed not with warmth or resolution, but with denial, betrayal, and a kind of bitterness that Hepburn reportedly carried for the rest of her life. Even while remaining close to Spencer Tracy, she was quietly holding on to wounds from these hidden chapters that she never spoke about openly. The question that naturally comes to mind is simple. Was Hepburn protecting herself by keeping these feelings private, or was she quietly holding on to emotional conflicts she was never willing to face out loud? The more you look into the stories behind each name, the more the bitterness begins to make sense. If you find these kinds of hidden Hollywood stories as fascinating as we do, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are so many untold stories from this era, and we cover them regularly. Now, let's get into the names. The first name that comes up most often is Greta Garbo. On the surface, it might seem like these two women would have understood each other perfectly. Hepburn was known for her discipline and sharp thinking. Garbo was the great mystery of Hollywood, a woman who said almost nothing in public and let her silence speak for her. When their paths crossed in the late 1930s, the tension between them was said to be immediate. Rumors began to circulate that the two women started seeing each other privately, going out of their way to avoid photographers, studio events, and any situation where they might be seen together. They met in quiet Manhattan apartments and carefully planned weekend gatherings where they never showed up at the same time. For a while, that arrangement seemed to work well enough, but the ending, when it finally came, was colder than almost anyone expected. Garbo didn't simply lose interest or drift away slowly. Instead, she withdrew in a way that left something lasting and painful behind. She began denying that any kind of relationship had ever existed, and she did it both in public and in private settings where people already knew the truth. The moment that reportedly broke everything happened at a small gathering in New York. Several people there already knew about the connection between the two women, so there was no real need for performance. But Garbo walked into the room, made brief eye contact with Hepburn, and then deliberately turned her back. She proceeded to speak to others about how completely alone she was, even laughing as she said she had never truly belonged to anyone. Hepburn understood exactly what was happening. She left the gathering without saying goodbye to anyone. That same night, people close to her said Hepburn vented her feelings privately, saying that Garbo had only ever turned to her when it was convenient, and then acted as though the entire connection had been invented. From that point on, whatever warmth had existed between the two women hardened into something entirely different. Garbo never reached out. She never offered an explanation. She simply behaved as if the meetings, the closeness, and everything they had shared had never taken place. For Hepburn, that kind of erasure was something she simply could not forgive. Years later, without ever mentioning Garbo's name directly, she made her feelings about this type of behavior very clear. She reportedly said at one point that she had no patience for people who wiped away shared history simply to protect themselves. The two women continued to live in the same city for years after that. Their social circles occasionally crossed paths, but Hepburn reportedly made sure she was never alone in the same room with Garbo again. Whenever Garbo's name came up in conversation, Hepburn's tone would become short and cold almost immediately. It wasn't simple irritation, it was the specific kind of anger that comes from feeling used and then completely denied.
The moment that many people point to as the first real break happened at a studio dinner attended by MGM executives. Crawford arrived late and deliberately sat down beside Hepburn. Then, in the middle of conversation, she reached over and grabbed Hepburn's arm, saying loudly enough for the entire table to hear that Kate didn't need love, she needed an audience. The whole table went quiet. Hepburn's response was completely calm. She removed Crawford's hand from her arm without any risible anger and said simply that she had never confused affection with having people watch her. That single exchange changed the tone of everything between them. After that evening, Crawford began showing up wherever Hepburn was. She would request seats near her at award ceremonies and public events, making it almost impossible for Hepburn to avoid her presence. Hepburn responded in the way she always did when someone pushed too hard. She arrived late to events, left early, and kept her back turned when Crawford was nearby. At one point, during a New York event, Crawford leaned close and told Hepburn directly that she didn't get to simply ignore her. Hepburn said nothing in response. She stood up, picked up her coat, and walked out. A columnist who witnessed the scene later described it as one of the coldest exits she had ever seen at a public event. In private, Hepburn was more direct about how she felt. Through her longtime friend, Phyllis Wilburn, it was later reported that Hepburn had said Crawford didn't actually want closeness. What she wanted was control, and control was the one thing Hepburn would never hand over to anyone. Whatever connection had once existed between them ended completely after that period. When Crawford's name came up in later interviews, Hepburn shut down the conversation immediately. In one exchange in 1983, she cut a question about Crawford short by saying simply that she didn't go back to battles that had been finished years ago. Being ignored by Hepburn wasn't a passive thing, it was a deliberate final judgment. The third name is Tallulah Bankhead, and the story here is perhaps the most complicated of all. Bankhead wasn't someone Hepburn drifted into a minor friendship with. She was someone Hepburn would later decide she should never have become close to in the first place. By 1938, the two women were spending time together in ways that were clearly more than ordinary friendship. Their meetings reportedly took place late at night in Bankhead's hotel suites in New York, usually after theater performances, with no assistants present and no public appearances attached. It was a circle of trusted company and closed doors. What made the connection exciting also made it risky. Bankhead treated secrecy like a game, something fun to play with. Hepburn treated it as something essential, a form of protection without which everything she had built could fall apart. That fundamental difference eventually became impossible to ignore. The breaking point reportedly came at a private gathering hosted by playwright George S. Kaufman. Bankhead had been drinking and was entertaining the room in her usual confident style. Then she glanced toward Hepburn and made a comment with a smile, suggesting that some people hide their pleasures while she preferred hers to be memorable. The room laughed. Hepburn did not. Later that same night, she found Bankhead alone in a hallway and confronted her quietly. She told Bankhead that what she was doing wasn't bravery, it was carelessness. Bankhead laughed it off and told her to relax. That reaction, according to people who witnessed the exchange, was the end of everything. The very next day, Hepburn cut off all contact. No calls, no visits, no shared appearances of any kind. When Bankhead later sent a light-hearted note trying to reconnect, Hepburn sent it back without opening it. Years later, Hepburn would speak generally about trust, without ever naming specific people. She described trust not as something romantic, but as something closer to survival. For her, the Bankhead situation wasn't about a relationship ending badly in the emotional sense. It was about genuine danger. Bankhead had treated the possibility of exposure as something amusing, something to hint at and joke about in private circles. Hepburn believed that kind of exposure could destroy everything. When the risk became real enough to feel,
She removed it without any hesitation and without looking back. The fourth name is Barbara Stanwyck. This one is particularly interesting because, on the surface, Stanwyck and Hepburn had so much in common. Both were strong, controlled, and fiercely private. Both had built careers through discipline and a refusal to be defined by anyone else's expectations. Ironically, that very similarity may have been what made their falling out so damaging. By the early 1940s, the two women had reportedly developed a bond that neither of them ever intended to become visible. Their meetings were arranged with careful precision: late dinners at a restaurant after it had closed for the night, quiet drives along Mulholland Drive without any staff present, and weekend plans arranged so that they would never be seen arriving or leaving together.
For Hepburn, all of that secrecy was never about hiding something shameful. It was a form of trust between two people who understood what was at stake. That was what made Stanwyck's eventual withdrawal so painful. Slowly, Stanwyck began pulling away. Phone calls were not returned. Plans were made and then quietly dropped. There was no clear conversation, no honest ending, just a slow retreat that left Hepburn facing a silence Stanwyck seemed unwilling to acknowledge or explain. The tension finally came to a head at a small industry gathering at the home of a film producer. Hepburn pulled Stanwyck aside and asked her directly whether they were going to pretend that nothing had happened or whether Stanwyck was going to explain why she was withdrawing. Stanwyck's answer was brief. She said that some things were better left without names. For Hepburn, that response wasn't caution or reasonable self-protection, it was denial. A quiet attempt to rewrite the past and pretend a shared reality had never existed simply because it was easier. She later told Phyllis Wilburn that she didn't have contempt for weakness itself, but she could not stand people who then pretended she had imagined the intimacy they had shared. After that exchange, she closed the door on the relationship entirely. She never raised the subject again and never attempted to close the distance. At public events, she remained polite to Stanwyck, but nothing more. Years later, Hepburn summed up her general belief in a line that people close to her recognized immediately. She believed that clarity was a form of respect, and that silence after genuine closeness was a form of cruelty. The fifth name that comes up in these accounts is Judy Holliday. With Holliday, the situation was somewhat different from the others. It wasn't primarily about secrecy or denial in the cold, deliberate way it had been with the others. It was about something Hepburn considered even more fundamental, which was courage versus fear. In the late 1940s, Holliday was rising quickly in Hollywood, but was genuinely anxious about her contracts, her reputation, and the very real dangers of being labeled in an industry that punished anything seen as unconventional. During that difficult period, she reportedly leaned heavily on Hepburn for guidance and support. What began as a kind of mentorship gradually became something more private, a closeness that both women worked to keep completely out of public view. For Hepburn, secrecy in this case was never about shame. It was about loyalty and the trust that comes from knowing someone genuinely has your back. The fracture came when the pressure became too much for Holliday. As studio scrutiny increased and rumors began to circulate, Holliday chose to step back rather than stand firm. Instead of facing the situation alongside Hepburn, she quietly began distancing herself, protecting her image and her career without explaining what she was doing or why. The turning point came backstage during a film production. Hepburn addressed it directly, asking Holliday plainly whether she was stepping away or whether she was simply afraid. Holliday didn't deny what they had shared. She answered quietly that she couldn't afford the situation right now. According to Phyllis Wilburn, that sentence ended things instantly. Hepburn didn't raise her voice or argue. She simply grew quiet and said that fear might explain choices, but it didn't excuse erasing the truth of what had happened. Within days, she had cut off all contact. When Holliday later sent an apologetic note, it was returned unopened, not as a cruel gesture, but as a final judgment.
Hepburn later expressed her general view on this kind of situation clearly. She had deep respect for courage, but she could not accept fear that then pretended nothing had ever existed. The two women never reconciled. Holliday died young, and Hepburn never spoke her name publicly again. Taken together, these stories paint a picture of Katharine Hepburn that is more complicated and more human than the Iron Woman image she projected throughout her career. Behind the control and the sharp public persona were real emotional connections, carefully hidden from the world, that ended not in warmth, but in silence, denial, and wounds she apparently never fully let go of. Each relationship ended on its own terms, but they all shared a common thread. The moment someone erased what had been real, Hepburn's response was always the same. She closed the door, returned the letter unopened, and never looked back. Which of these hidden relationships do you think affected her most deeply? And which one do you feel crossed a line she simply could never forgive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy these deep dives into the untold stories of classic Hollywood, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notifications so you never miss an upload. There is so much more of this history waiting to be explored, and we are just getting started.